Platte Valley, Nebraska, October 1878. The prairie wind had a voice, and this time of year, it spoke of what was coming. It was a low, ceaseless moan that scoured the land, stripping the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and pressing the tall grass flat against the earth. It was a wind that found every crack, every nail hole, every poorly set pane of glass. For the homesteaders, it was the sound of a coming enemy. And it was into this wind that Søren Vahl was building something no one had ever seen. His cabin, a solid, well-chinked structure of cottonwood logs, was already finished. A respectable home by any measure. But he wasn't done. He was now erecting a second, thinner wall of planks around the entire building, set off from the main logs by 6 inches. It looked flimsy, almost skeletal, a ghost of a house surrounding the real one. Amos Klein, a man who had built more cabins in the Platte Valley than anyone, stopped his wagon, his hands tight on the reins. He was a practical man, a man of right angles and proven methods. What he saw defied all frontier logic. He watched Søren meticulously fitting another plank, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "Vahl," Klein called out, his voice sharp against the wind. "What in God's name are you doing?" Søren paused, turning his head. He was a quiet man, his face weathered not just by the Nebraska sun but by the salt spray of a distant sea. "I am building a wall, Mr. Klein." "I can see that," Klein said, stepping down from his wagon. He walked over, his boots sinking slightly into the turned soil. A few other men, Jedediah Potts and Caleb Finch among them, had gathered, drawn by the strange construction. "That's a fool's waste of good lumber. That flimsy thing won't stop a child's push, let alone a winter storm. What's the purpose?" Søren ran a hand over the fresh sawn plank. "The purpose is not to be strong," he said, his Danish accent softening the edges of his words. "The purpose is to be still." Klein let out a short, hard laugh. "Still? It's a wall, man, not a prayer. You're building a fence around your house that will do nothing but catch snow and rot. You'd be better off stacking that wood by your stove." He gestured to the 6-inch gap between the log cabin and the new plank shell. "And this space, what's that for? Collecting mice?" The other men chuckled. They respected Klein. He knew how to build a house that stood. This was madness. A strange idea from a strange man from a strange country. Søren's foolish wall became the talk of the small settlement. It was a landmark of eccentricity, a monument to wasted effort. Søren simply nodded, offered no further explanation, and turned back to his work. He picked up his hammer, the sound of his solitary blows swallowed by the immense, howling emptiness of the prairie. The mockery lasted for the rest of the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the winter. What did this Danish ship caulker, a man who had spent his life sealing the hulls of vessels against the North Sea, understand about the physics of prairie wind that these seasoned, expert homestead builders had so completely missed? The story of how a simple, 6-inch gap of air defeated a Nebraska blizzard is more than a tale of clever construction. It's a lesson in seeing the true nature of an enemy. If you find these stories of frontier ingenuity as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing to this channel. I promise you will learn something about the hidden science that allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive. Let me know in the comments. What's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever seen? Søren Vahl was not a carpenter, not in the way Amos Klein was. He had not spent his life framing barns or raising houses from the soil up. He was not a farmer, coaxing life from the stubborn prairie sod. He was a man of seams and gaps. His world, for 30 years, had been the shipyards of Esbjerg, Denmark. His tools were not the broadex and the saw, but the caulking iron, the mallet, and the serving board. His materials were not logs and nails, but oakum, tarred hemp fibers, and hot, black pitch. His trade was the art of making a thing whole, of finding the space where two planks met and rendering it impenetrable. He knew, with an intimacy that bordered on instinct, that the greatest threat to a ship was not the towering wave, but the hairline crack that let the sea inside. He and his wife Meta and their two children, Lars and Ingrid, had come to America for the promise of land. They had survived the ocean crossing, a testament to the work of men like him. But their first winter in Nebraska, in a hastily built, standard log cabin, had been a different kind of trial. It was a siege, not of water, but of air. Søren remembered it with a clarity that still chilled him. He remembered the way the simple calico curtains Meta had hung would lift and dance, animated by invisible currents of frigid air. He remembered the kerosene lamps on the table, their flames guttering and flickering, as if in a constant breeze, casting nervous shadows on the walls. He remembered waking in the morning to see delicate, cruel filigrees of frost tracing the seams between the logs on the inside of their home. They had burned through their woodpile at an astonishing rate, the big cast-iron stove glowing red-hot, consuming fuel with a ravenous appetite. Yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the stove. It was a fugitive warmth, chased from the room by the relentless infiltration of the cold. Meta had kept the children, Lars and Ingrid, bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces peeking out, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. It was a cold that got into the bones, a damp, life-sapping chill that made every morning a struggle for survival. Søren, the master of sealing gaps, had been defeated by 1,000 tiny gaps he couldn't even see. That winter, he didn't just feel the cold, he studied it. He watched it. He learned its ways. The problem, as the homesteaders of the Platte Valley saw it, was the cold itself. It was a monolithic force, an elemental enemy to be fought with bigger fires and thicker walls. Amos Klein and the others built their cabins accordingly. They used the biggest logs they could find, chinking the gaps between them with a mixture of mud, grass, and clay. Their walls were fortresses of solid mass, designed to physically block the cold from entering. On a calm, still day, this method worked reasonably well. A thick log wall has a decent R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow. A 12-inch cottonwood log could slow the transfer of heat from inside to outside, but the Platte Valley was rarely calm. The true enemy wasn't the temperature on the thermometer. It was the wind, the ceaseless, driving, soul-crushing wind. This is where the conventional wisdom failed, and failed catastrophically. The problem wasn't conduction, heat leaking slowly through solid material. The problem was convection. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids like air. A cabin in winter is like a warm stone in a cold river. The river of wind flows over its surface, constantly stripping away the thin layer of warm air that clings to the walls and replacing it with a fresh layer of cold. This process, sometimes called wind wash, accelerates heat loss at a terrifying rate. A 20-degree day with a 20-mile-per-hour wind feels like 4 degrees below zero for a reason. That wind is actively stealing heat from any warm surface, including the walls of a cabin. The homesteaders' cabins, for all their mass, were leaky. The mud and grass chinking would dry and shrink, opening up microscopic cracks. The places where the roof met the walls, where window frames were set into the logs, these were all highways for air infiltration. The wind would force cold air in on the windward side and suck warm air out on the leeward side. Inside Jedediah Potts's cabin, a candle placed near the wall would have its flame bent sideways, a silent testament to the invisible river of cold air flowing through his home. They were fighting the cold with fire, while ignoring the wind that was stealing the heat from their walls and their very lungs. They were trying to boil the river. Søren Vahl, the ship caulker, saw it differently. He knew you couldn't stop the ocean. You could only stop it from getting in. The wind was the ocean, and his cabin was the ship. The solution wasn't a thicker hull, but a perfectly sealed one. And if he couldn't make the main hull perfect, he would build another one around it. The construction of the outer shell was an exercise in meticulous detail that further baffled his neighbors. He began by setting 4x4 posts into the ground, 2 feet deep, at each corner of his cabin and every 8 feet along the walls. These posts stood exactly 1 foot away from his log walls. He then ran horizontal stringers, simple 2x4s, connecting these posts at the top, middle, and bottom. This created a rigid, freestanding frame that surrounded his home, but did not touch it. This was the point when Amos Klein had made his second visit. "Vahl, you've built a corral for your house?" he'd said, shaking his head. "If you'd asked, I'd have told you to use that lumber for a proper woodshed." Søren was fitting the vertical planks to the stringers. They were simple, 1-inch thick pine boards, nothing special. But he wasn't just nailing them up. After setting each plank, he took a bucket of hot pitch and a bundle of oakum. Using a caulking iron, he hammered the tarred fibers into the seam between the new plank and the one beside it, just as he would have done on the deck of a fishing trawler. The smell of hot tar, a scent of the sea, now hung in the dry prairie air. "This is your plan?" Klein asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and pity. "You're tarring your walls? The sun in July will turn that into a sticky, stinking mess." "The sun is not the enemy now," Søren replied, his focus entirely on the seam. He didn't just seal the gaps between the planks. He meticulously sealed the bottom edge where the planks met the ground, packing it with a mixture of clay and pitch to stop any air from entering from below. He built a simple shed roof over the top of the 6-inch gap, sloping it away from the cabin and sealing the point where it met the outer plank wall. He was not building a wall. He was building a bell jar. He was creating a 6-inch boundary of trapped, unmoving air. The cost was minimal. The lumber was second-grade pine, costing him a total of $12. The pitch and oakum were another $2, $14, and 3 weeks of his own labor. To Klein, it was $14 thrown to the wind. To Søren, it was the cheapest ship he had ever built. When he was finished, his wife Meta came out. She looked at the strange, plain, windowless box that now encased their home. "It is very plain, Søren. It is not for looks, my dear," he said. He led her to the inner wall of their actual cabin, the familiar cottonwood logs. He put his hand on it. "This is our home." Then he walked to the new outer wall and put his hand on that. "And this is its coat." His children, Lars and Ingrid, didn't understand the purpose, but they understood the result. Their strange-looking house now had a narrow, secret passageway all the way around it, a hidden corridor 6 inches wide. It was a source of endless fascination, but its real magic was invisible. The physics behind Søren's wall was both simple and profound. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, through direct contact; radiation, through electromagnetic waves; and convection, through the movement of fluids. While his log walls addressed conduction to some degree, they were utterly defenseless against convection driven by the wind. Think of the heat inside a cabin as a pool of water. Conduction is a slow leak through the bottom of the pool. Convection, the wind, is a man with a bucket, actively scooping water out and throwing it away. You can't plug the leak while ignoring the man with the bucket. Søren's double wall didn't try to stop the wind. It surrendered to it. The outer plank wall was designed to take the full force of the gale. The wind could howl against it, scour it, and strip heat from its surface all it wanted, But the air inside the 6-inch gap was protected. Because the gap was sealed at the top and bottom, the air within it could not circulate. It could not move. It became a 6-inch blanket of stationary air, and still air is a remarkably effective insulator. To put it in numbers, a typical log wall might have an R value of about 1 per inch, so a 10-inch log wall would be R10. But a 20-mile-per-hour wind can effectively reduce that R value by half or more due to wind wash, making it perform like an R5 wall. The heat, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, pours out of it. Søren's system created a buffer. The outer wall bore the brunt of the wind. The air in the gap, being still, did not transfer heat by convection. The only way heat could get across that gap was through slow radiation and even slower conduction through the air molecules themselves. The inner log wall, now protected from the wind, could perform at its full R10 potential. Essentially, Søren had separated the two main functions of a wall. The outer shell became the windbreak. The inner wall became the insulator. A conventional cabin forced one wall to do both jobs, and it failed at both. The most critical part was the seal. If there were gaps at the top or bottom of the cavity, the wind would simply flow through it, creating a chimney effect and making the situation even worse. This is what the experienced carpenter Klein missed, and what the ship caulker Vahl understood in his bones. It wasn't about the lumber, it was about the seal. He had stopped the man with the bucket. That winter arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a roar. In the 3rd week of November, a blizzard descended on the Platte Valley. It was not a single storm, but a 3-day siege. The homesteaders called it a blizzard run, a continuous assault of wind and snow that erased the world, burying fences, obscuring landmarks, and turning the prairie into a churning, white sea. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, but the wind was the real killer. A steady 40-mile-per-hour gale that drove the snow with the force of sand, piling it into massive drifts, and finding its way through the smallest of openings. For most families, it was a repeat of the misery of the previous winter, only magnified. Inside Amos Klein's expertly built cabin, the fire in the stove was never allowed to die. His wife Sarah kept a kettle of water on it constantly, not for tea, but so the steam might add a small defense against the dry, invasive cold. Despite the roaring fire, the far corners of their main room were barely above freezing. They lived in a small bubble of warmth, huddled close to the iron stove. Any journey to the other side of the room was a venture into a different climate. At night, they slept with every blanket piled on top of them, their breath crystallizing in the air. Klein was burning through his woodpile at a rate that alarmed him. He was using nearly 1/4 of a cord a day just to keep the cabin habitable. 2 homesteads over, the situation at Jedediah Potts's place was worse. Their cabin was smaller and less meticulously chinked. The wind didn't just rattle the windows, it seemed to flow through the walls themselves. The snow, fine and hard as dust, was driven through the cracks, forming small, ghostly white lines on the floorboards along the base of the walls. Their children coughed, a dry, hacking sound that spoke of air too cold to breathe comfortably. They were surviving, but just barely, confined to a few feet of space around a stove that was failing to hold back the siege. But at the Vahl cabin, something remarkable was happening. Nothing. The gale shrieked and howled against the outer plank wall. It threw snow against it with such force that it sounded like handfuls of gravel. The wind was a physical presence, a battering ram of immense power. Yet inside the log cabin, there was a profound and uncanny stillness. The flame in their kerosene lamp burned with a steady, unwavering light. The calico curtains Meta had hung limp and motionless. The air was not just warm, it was evenly warm. Lars and Ingrid could play on the floor in the corner farthest from the stove and feel no chill. Meta sat in her rocking chair, doing fine needlework, her fingers nimble and warm, a task that would have been impossible the winter before. The smell of baking bread filled the small home, a scent of peace and domesticity that was an act of defiance against the chaos raging just inches away. Søren fed the stove a single log every few hours. His wood consumption was less than a third of his neighbor's. The heat he produced stayed where it belonged, inside his home. The quiet protagonist in this drama was the 6 inches of still, trapped air that was breaking the back of the blizzard. The proof of its success was the deep, uninterrupted sleep of his children. On the second day of the blizzard, Amos Klein knew he was in trouble. The wind had shifted slightly, and a drift was beginning to form against his livestock shed, threatening to block the door. If he couldn't get to his animals to feed and water them, they wouldn't survive. Bundled in everything he owned, he tied a rope from his cabin door to the shed, a lifeline in the blinding whiteout, and ventured into the storm. The force of the wind was staggering. It was a solid wall of air that stole his breath and pushed him back. The cold was a physical pain on any exposed skin. He fought his way to the shed, cleared the snow from the door, and tended to his animals. The journey back to the cabin, a distance of only 50 yards, was a brutal struggle. He was exhausted, the cold seeping through his layers of wool. As he neared his own door, he glanced in the direction of Søren Vahl's place. Through a momentary thinning of the swirling snow, he saw the stark, featureless outline of Vahl's strange outer wall. Curiosity, and perhaps a desperate need to believe that someone, somewhere, was not suffering as he was, pulled him off his path. He stumbled toward the Danes' homestead, leaning hard into the wind. He reached the plank wall and practically fell against it. The wind hammered at his back, trying to tear him away. The raw, unplaned wood was plastered with a thick layer of wind-driven snow, packed as hard as ice. He braced himself against the unrelenting assault of the storm, catching his breath. This was the enemy, right here, this physical, violent pressure. This was what was destroying them. Then he did something that would change how he built for the rest of his life. He reached out with his gloved right hand and touched the log wall of the inner cabin, just 6 inches away. He expected to feel the familiar, bone-deep cold of an exterior wall. He expected to feel the vibration of the wind, the house shuddering under the blizzard's assault. He felt nothing. There was no vibration. There was no biting cold. Through his thick leather glove, he could feel only a deep, profound stillness. The log was cool, but it was the neutral cool of insulated wood, not the life-stealing cold of the storm. It was completely, utterly inert. It was as if the blizzard simply did not exist. He pulled his glove off with his teeth, his fingers already stiffening. He pressed his bare palm against the log wall. It was dry. He looked down. The snow was packed in a solid mass against the outer shell, but the 6-inch gap at the bottom was clear, and the foundation of the inner cabin was bare and dry. Not a single snowflake had reached it. The snow was hitting the outer wall, and the wind was so cold that it stayed frozen there, never getting the chance to melt from heat escaping the inner cabin. That was the proof. The escaping heat wasn't even enough to melt the snow on the outer shell. He stood there for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the calm, dry logs, while the blizzard raged against his back. The contrast was so absolute, so undeniable, it felt like a law of physics being revealed to him for the first time. He finally understood. Søren hadn't built a flimsy wall. He'd built a shield of stillness. He had captured the air itself and turned it into a defense. He made his way back to his own cabin, the truth settling in him, heavier than the cold. The next day, when the storm finally broke, the sun glinting on a world remade in white, Amos Klein walked over to Søren Vahl's home. Søren was outside, calmly clearing a path. Klein walked right up to him. He didn't offer apologies or excuses. He simply looked at the double-walled house, then back at the man who had built it. "You didn't build a cabin, Søren," Amos Klein said, his voice quiet with a new kind of respect. "You built a calm." News on the frontier traveled not by newspaper, but by word of mouth, carried from one homestead to the next, shared over coffee in a general store, or passed between crews working on the railroad. The story of Søren Vahl's calm cabin spread through the Platte Valley that spring. At first it was treated as a curiosity, another tall tale. But Amos Klein, a man whose opinion on building carried immense weight, became its most powerful advocate. When people asked him how to prepare for the next winter, he didn't talk about bigger logs or more chinking. He told them to go talk to the Dane. That summer, more than a dozen families built their own versions of the double-shell wall. They called it the Vahl Wall, or the Dutchman's jacket, misremembering his origin but not the effectiveness of his design. The real test of its influence, however, came from an unexpected quarter: the Union Pacific Railroad. The lifeblood of the Prairie was the steel rail, and maintaining it required section houses to be built every 10 to 15 miles. These were small, simple structures, homes for the crews who walked the tracks daily, checking for damage. They were notoriously cold, thrown up quickly and cheaply. The railroad was constantly losing men who quit rather than face another winter in a flimsy section house. A Union Pacific foreman, hearing the story from a homesteader while buying supplies, saw not eccentricity, but efficiency. The cost of a few extra planks was nothing compared to the cost of constantly hiring and transporting new crews. That autumn, the railroad authorized a test. They retrofitted 3 section houses between Kearney and North Platte, with a version of Søren's double-shell design. The results were immediate and dramatic. The crews in the retrofitted houses reported unprecedented comfort, and more importantly to the Union Pacific's accountants, their fuel allotment of coal dropped by over 60%. By 1880, the air-jacketed design, as the railroad's engineers called it, was the standard for all new small-scale construction along the Union Pacific line in Nebraska and Wyoming. From a single man's memory of sealing a ship's hull, a new architectural vernacular for the Prairie was born. It was a quiet revolution, built of cheap lumber and still air. What Søren Vahl pioneered in 1878 was a crude but brilliant anticipation of modern building science. Today, we call the principle he employed a rain screen, or a vented wall assembly, though his was unvented to maximize insulation. High-performance modern buildings are essentially complex versions of his idea. They feature an outer cladding that acts as a weather barrier, an air gap, and then an inner, insulated, airtight structural wall. We now understand in precise R values and BTU calculations what Søren Vahl understood in principle: that separating the functions of a wall, weather resistance from insulation, creates a system far more effective than a single massive barrier. His 6-inch gap of still air was the 19th century equivalent of modern high-performance insulation, achieving its goal with the simplest of materials. He was a century ahead of his time, using tar and pine to achieve what we now do with house wrap and spray foam. There is a lesson in the quiet genius of Søren Vahl that goes beyond the physics of heat transfer. The frontier taught a hard and simple truth. Nature does not care about your traditions, your credentials, or what everyone else is doing. It rewards what works. The other homesteaders saw the wind as a force to be resisted, so they built thicker, heavier walls. Theirs was a battle of brute force. Søren saw the wind as a current to be diverted. He chose not to fight it, but to sidestep it. He didn't add more strength. He added a space. His neighbors saw a wall as a thing that stops the wind. Søren understood it was the wind that stops the wall from doing its job of holding heat. The solution, then, was to give the wind a wall to fight, a sacrificial outer layer that would occupy its attention. By adding a wall, he effectively removed the wind from the equation. The wall you add is the wind you lose. It's a principle that applies to more than just cabins. Sometimes the most effective way to deal with an overwhelming force is not to meet it head-on, but to build a quiet space where it simply cannot reach. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier innovation. If you believe these lessons from the past have value today, please like this video and subscribe for more. And as always, a quick disclaimer. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Should you consider applying any of these building techniques today, please consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.